Good morning, everyone. I'm glad to see you again at the Scientific University Colloquium. This is our 12th colloquium in this season. 2 days ago we had 11th, and now it's the 12th colloquium. And today's guest professor is Professor David Miller, University of Oxford, United Kingdom. And the topic of his presentation and lecture will be Justice in Integration. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. And maybe you can say a few words, something to introduce yourself at the beginning, just in 2 minutes, and after that you can start with your presentation. And as I know, as a part of the schedule of this summer school, you will discuss with audience after that about your presentation. Okay. In front of the University of Rijeka and its rector and myself, welcome here at our university and our scientific colloquium. And please start with your
Thank you, Alison. Thank you, everybody. I'm David Miller. I'm Nuffield College, Oxford, and Professor of Physical Theory at the University of Oxford. This talk I'm giving today is related to work I've been doing in recent months, a couple of years, on the topic of immigration, but it grows out of some much longer-standing interests of mine. Longer-standing of all, being the questions of justice, which was my original topic as a doctoral student. I've written 3 books in the sense about aspects of justice. More recently, I've worked on questions about nationality and national responsibility. And in 2007, I wrote a book called National Responsibility and Global Justice, which talked about the responsibilities of the state towards the world at large. And in that book, there was a short discussion of the issue of immigration, because obviously that's one of the most important practical questions in relation to global justice that democratic states face today. So I suppose I've been working more on that and on associated questions about human rights and immigration, the 2 of the topics I've worked on particularly in the last 2 or 3 years. And I'm hoping very much to finish a relatively short book on political philosophy of immigration by this October. You probably need some sort of revision after that, but I hope to have a draft of it by this October. So this is a very good opportunity to lay out some of the ideas in that book. So let me see if I can make this PowerPoint work. It's always a bit of a challenge. Let's try and see if I can make it work. Okay. So we know how to get rid of the full screen.
F5.
Sorry?
F5.
Alright, and to read slides, it's just as long as okay, yeah. Okay, is it? Yeah, good, thank you. Yeah. So, immigration, a much politically very controversial topic. In my country, I don't know how it stands in Croatia in relation to other questions, but when voters are asked in the UK, which they think are the most demanding issues at the present moment, it's the economy and jobs, obviously it's always that's an issue, but immigration is one of the top 2 or 3 people mentioned. And in Britain it becomes entangled also with questions about EU membership, so it's quite a big issue. assume that the immigration policy the Liberal state pursues is quite properly shaped by a number of different factors, including the economic needs of the country, its cultural, its linguistic makeup, its population density, ecological concerns, and so on and so forth. All of these factors bear upon immigration. Indeed, I'd say that it's one of the most important aspects of national self-determination that a people should be able to control and make choices about who joins it as prospective members of the citizen body. And having said that there should be a wide scope of choice about immigration, there are also constraints of justice that apply to it. And what I'm trying to do here is to explain what those constraints are. If anybody doubts that, if anybody thinks that there's no real justice question, think about a state that simply denies access to anybody who identifies as gay or lesbian. We would think that was outrageously unjust, a policy of that kind. But then if you ask, well, what exactly are these constraints, and how much discretion does justice allow? I think we're much less certain. Perhaps the most important question is whether there are some people that a liberal state is obliged to permit, or again, can it always refuse entry at the end, no matter what? Now the question, how should we think about this? So we have this topic. There are many theories of justice. You've been talking about some of them in the seminars so far this week. Many of them developed in response to the seminal work of John Rawls. But the problem, I think, is that these theories were developed for use within the nation state. As Rawls puts it, his theory applies to the basic structure that distributes rights and opportunities between people who are already part of a single political community. That's the way the theory is developed by Rawls, and also by people who responded to him, of course, others and so on. But immigrants, of course, are not yet inside the political community. They want to be covered by something like rules in basic structure, but so far they're not yet part of it. Now, of course, there are also now many theories about global justice, a popular field of inquiry, or obligations we have to people worldwide. But these theories are too broad because they apply to people who are connected only by the fact of common humanity, have no specific relation to one another, other than the fact that they inhabit a world together. So there's no room here within theories of global justice for the specific relationship that obtains between a potential immigrant and the receiving state, which is, in many cases, one of vulnerability. The immigrant becomes vulnerable in certain ways to the state that he or she wants to join. So I think, therefore, we have to work out in quite specific terms what principles of justice should apply to this relationship, the specific relation between the would-be immigrant and the receiving state. Now, of course, we shouldn't neglect either questions about social justice or questions about global justice, but I want to suggest that they should come in a secondary way after we have looked specifically at what justice requires in relation to specific immigrants. So the state-immigrant relation is the first topic, and then after that we have to look at what are the implications, the wider implications, both for social justice within the state and for global justice. Now I want to suggest a framework for looking at this problem. And I think we can think of it as having two dimensions. First, whether the immigrant is already physically present on the state's territory and is therefore subject to its jurisdiction, or on the other hand is just outside wanting to come in and not yet subject to jurisdiction. That's the first dimension. And then secondly, the second dimension is what kind of claim for admission is the immigrant making to justify admission. So let me just say a bit about each of these two dimensions. So first of all, we're seeing from somebody who's currently inside the state and somebody who's not. So why would somebody be inside? Well, either the person maybe has entered illegally, or perhaps she's come in on a fixed-term visa of some sort, but that has now expired, and so she's in a kind of legal limbo, not yet granted admission. There's also, though, a third case, which is actually somebody at the border, somebody physically standing in front of an immigration official. Big sign says, here's the border, here's the immigration official. Somebody standing there. And I think that's an interesting third case, and I'll talk a bit about that case in a moment. What about the general case about physical presence? Why does it matter whether the immigrant's inside or outside? Well, I think we need here a theory about the state's right to territory. What is it that entitles the state to control the territory that the immigrant wants to enter? Now, the kind of view that I favour, a legitimate state that claims territorial rights must offer certain protections to all those who are physically present on the territory. So if the state claims the right of jurisdiction over the territory, claims the right to make and enforce laws throughout the territory, and apply the law to everybody who's physically present on it, and to make good that claim, it must at the very least protect the basic rights of all those who are present to a sufficiently high standard. I mean, it doesn't matter exactly how high that standard has to be, but there is some kind of minimal level of protection that a legitimate state must offer. And this includes the immigrant, including the illegal immigrant. So the person who's already arrived, the state asserts its right to apply its laws to him, to arrest him, for example, if he's committed a crime. But in return, it has an obligation to protect certain of his rights. None of that applies to the person who's outside who's applied to join. The person who's outside, the state does not assert its authority over that person, doesn't attempt to make it subject to its laws. So whatever obligations the state has to this person don't arise as a corollary of the exercise of jurisdiction. In contrast, the person is physically present in the territory of the state and is subject to its law and policy. He has a reciprocal claim against the state that it should at least protect its human rights. And that includes not merely not violating them by attacking him, but also by making available some basic resources, subsistence, health care, and so on and so forth. Well, what about the middle possibility? The person who's physically standing at the border. That person isn't yet subject to the jurisdiction of the receiving state. It can't tax him, constrict him, charge him for past crimes, and so on. Now, of course, as long as he continues to try and get in, he has to comply with the immigration rules of the state. And that applies also to the person who's away from the border and is outside. So, of course, if the person tries to force his way in, then he's going to be subject to coercive force. But that also applies to the person who's physically away from the border. So, what difference does it being at the border? Well, I think what it does is it imposes on the receiving state an immediate duty of care. And I think that becomes most apparent when you think of these cases, these rather tragic cases of people who arrive by boats, often in terrible conditions, boats that are unsafe, liable to sink and so on. So if state officials are not going to admit people who arrive in this way, they must ensure that they're at least escorted to a place of safety. They can't simply turn the boat around and push it back out to sea. And I think the same logic applies to duties that arise at land borders and airports. These duties arise simply from the fact of physical proximity coupled with the capacity to assist. The same way, I think, is imagine you're just at home and somebody collapses on your doorstep. Then just that fact of physical proximity gives you a duty to care for the person. Now, you needn't take them in, you don't have to admit them to the house. You must at least, for example, see that they're taken to hospital or put in shelter or whatever is appropriate to their condition. And of course, it goes without saying also that state officials have duties of civility towards immigrants. So if they refuse entry, they have to explain why entry has been refused. They mustn't be abusive, and these are just general duties of respect for other human beings, again triggered by the fact of physical presence. So, that's the first dimension of the first part of my framework, where we can make distinctions between immigrants along these lines. The second dimension has to do with the kind of claim that the immigrant is making. Here I think it's going to be helpful to distinguish three categories of immigrants. And I think the first two are fairly familiar, but the third maybe is a little bit less so, so I'll talk a bit about that. So let's distinguish first of all refugees, people who are applying to enter on the grounds that their human rights are put seriously at risk by remaining in the state where they're currently resident. Now, I use a slightly broader definition than the 1951 Geneva Convention, which speaks of refugee as someone with a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular group or particular opinion, so has quite specific grounds for refugee status, persecution on the basis of these characteristics. But I think a broader definition, I think we can talk a bit about the definition of refugee later. I'm still working on this, but I think a broader definition than the Geneva Convention one is right, though one has to take care not to expand. Then second, there are people I call economic migrants. And these are people whose claim is based not on the threat to human rights, but simply on a strong interest in migrating. The interest might be of different kinds: opportunities to find work, opportunities to engage in forms of culture or religion that are not available in the home state, personal reasons for visiting other people, so on and so on. And then third, so economic, when I say economic, I'm using it in a broad sense. And third, what I call particularity claimants, people who make a specific claim against the state they're trying to enter. This might be backed up by different kinds of reasons. One might be reparative, that's to say, they're owed something by the receiving state for some harm or setback they've incurred in the past at the hands of the state. Or, on the other hand, there might be a sort of desert claim that they've done something to benefit the receiving state. They've served it in some way, and so they deserve something in return, and that what they deserve their claimant might be admission. And these claims can carry different amounts of weight. What they have in common, what distinguishes them from the first two, is that their claims against a particular state. The first two claims could be asserted in principle at least against any state. The third group have a claim against a particular state. So, just as a sample, so what I'm saying is you could have a kind of 3x3 matrix in which to place different types of immigrants. And on one side you would have a physical relation to the state on the inside, outside, or at the border. And then on the other axis you would have the kind of claim that they're making. Are they making a claim as a refugee, as an economic migrant, or as somebody having a particular claim against the receiving state? And then you have 9 possible boxes to fill. But actually, I'm not really now about this condition, so more about what I think the requirements of justice are in relation to these 3 categories of people. So I'm going to start with refugees. So, initially it seems that refugees have a very strong claim to it on grounds of human rights. Human rights are, I think, they sort of capture the most urgent moral demands that one human being can make against another. However, I think there are 2 ways in which that very strong initial claim has to be qualified. First is that it's limited to whatever is necessary to protect human rights and doesn't extend in any immediate way to the full set of rights and opportunities that a liberal state makes available to its own citizens. And also the claim may be time limited because it arises from the specific threat that the refugee is facing. It will cease to exist when that particular danger passes, when it becomes safe to return to the country of origin. In other words, the refugee's claim is initially a claim of sanctuary, not asylum. To be provided with a place of safety for as long as human rights remain endangered by remaining in the state of origin. The second qualification is that the responsibility to protect human rights is initially global in scope. It falls on all agents who are capable of responding to a vulnerable individual's human rights. And so the question is, how does it turn into a justice claim against a particular state? Now, of course, in practice it does, simply by the refugee turning up at the border, entering that mission and then applying for asylum. Now, generally, it's an arbitrary matter which state the refugee chooses to approach. And the particularity claims are being dealt with separately. And so, you might say, well, it's problematic from the receiving state's point of view. The arbitrary fact that somebody's come to your border gives you an obligation to protect their human rights. But I think the problem can be avoided as long as we're clear about what the state is required to do. Again, think of the analogy of the case of where an individual person confronts somebody in desperate need. That's also, in a sense, an arbitrary demand that falls on that person. But he must respond to it unless it's a matter of justice. What he's required to do, though, is to find some way in which that need can be met, and that may be a matter of calling upon other people on public services and so on institutions to provide the support. It's not required to carry the burden single-handed. So what are the responsibilities of the state towards refugees? Well, I think the first is that it must use a reliable procedure to establish the refugee status of claimant. That is quite a taxing requirement. Now's not the time, I think, to say exactly what form that procedure must take, what kind of evidence has to be collected to to establish whether somebody does have a valid claim to refugee status. But the essential aim is to identify people who belong to groups that are under threat in their society. It's partly about the society they come from, but also their personal characteristics that put them in danger of human rights violations. So that's the first requirement, first a serious investigation of the status of the individual. And then the question is how to respond. Either the refugee has to be admitted, temporary or permanent basis, but it may also be permissible to transfer refugees to other societies, provide asylum outside the borders of the state, by agreement with other states, so long as the human rights condition is met. And I think these agreements become particularly appropriate when we think the initial responsibility is allocated somewhat arbitrarily to the state that the refugee approaches. So you might say that ideally all refugee flows would be managed by an international body that would then have the responsibility to assign refugees between states on some principled basis. I think that's going to be a hard thing to set up in practice. And in the absence of that kind of procedure, I think it's permissible for states to limit their share of responsibility. And then one way we can do this is by entering into bilateral or multilateral agreements, placing refugees in different safe havens. Now, in practice, that's often going to be rich countries paying poorer countries to accommodate refugees. And if we look around us, we see that happening on quite a wide scale. Or is that objectionable? Many people think it is. But I'm not convinced, at least this is, I think, the important point, that if there are going to be schemes for transfer of refugees, then what's crucial is that the destination should provide adequate protection for the refugees' human rights. What that means is going to be affected by the length of stay. So if it's a short-term crisis, then purpose-built refugee camps may be adequate. But if it's going to stretch many years into the future, then I think human rights, such as the right to work, the right to practice a religion, to raise a family and so on, will become irrelevant. At that point, only full integration into the receiving society is going to provide sufficient opportunities. And in that case, the general standard of life in the receiving society becomes a relevant factor when deciding on destinations. I think it also implies that all refugees, whether or not it's their first choice state, may eventually be able to claim admission to citizenship as a matter of justice. That's not completely unconditional, there may be certain qualifying conditions, as with all admission to citizenship. But provided these are met, then it may be a matter of justice that rights to permanent residence and access to citizenship are granted to refugees in due course. Okay, now let me turn to the second category, people I call economic migrants. People whose human rights are not at risk, but who have a personal interest in moving to the new society, employment and other reasons. Now, in saying that their human rights are not at risk, I am of course assuming that there is no such thing as a general human right to immigrate. And that's an issue that I've addressed at some length in another talk, so I'm not going to give the full story here. But just to say very briefly, I take human rights to be rights whose joint fulfillment provides their bearer with the opportunity to live a legally decent life. And the right to cross borders is not an essential member of that set, because most people can lead decent lives while remaining in their present countries of residence. And although it's true that in the case of refugees, the right to move to a new society becomes instrumental to protecting their human rights generally, that doesn't make the right to immigrate itself into a human right. Any more so than because it's a human, one wouldn't say, for example, it's a human right to be anti-malarial drug or chloroquine, simply because for some people that's what's needed to fulfill their right to health care. You can't sort of ratchet up human rights in such a way that whenever a particular thing may be, for some people, instrumental to human rights, it becomes a human right itself. That's true. So, although economic migrants can properly demand the state they're trying to enter should respect their human rights while in the process of making a decision, so it should treat them humanely while they're present on the state soil, they can't wield human rights as the basis for their claim to enter. That's probably an issue we can come back to in the discussion. Now, for economic migrants, states are not under constraints of justice with respect to how many they can, if they choose, close their doors entirely. But they may be constrained in the selection procedures that they use. And that's less odd than it might appear at first sight. I mean, justice may not require the provision of some specific good or service, but if the goods are going to be provided, it may dictate how it's going to be distributed. In particular, it may act also in forms of discrimination. So that Michael Blake is a good example. It says that the state is not required as a matter of justice to give citizens each a car. But if it does decide to go to the business of giving people cars, it can't then give them only to whites and not to blacks. But, you might say, this requirement stems from the general principle of equal treatment that a state is required to follow in dealing with its own citizens, and we can't assume that the same principle will apply when it's dealing with outsiders. So why should the state not select economic migrants on any criteria that it likes, even including race? Intuitively, we feel it's unacceptable to select by race or religion. Why exactly? Well, one reason you might think is that there is a human right against discrimination. Find all policies, internal and external, prohibiting discrimination on these kinds of grounds. In fact, if you look at things like the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 26 says states shall not discriminate on grounds such as race, colour, sex, language, religion, political or other opinions laid out in the international charters. And that right, clearly needs interpretation, can't deduce its scope from the formal statement. There are many contexts in which one or other of these criteria can quite properly be used. For example, it wouldn't be considered a breach of human rights if a political party decides to draw up a rule shortlist for selection, or if a public broadcaster selects only those who speak Welsh, for example, to read the news, or if a church confines membership to those who adhere to its own faith. But these are examples of discrimination on grounds of sex, language, religion, so there can't be any kind of blanket ban on these forms of selection. So that approach isn't going to work. Well, the second possibility, is to say that selecting immigrants on grounds of, say, race or religion is an injustice to existing citizens who belong to those categories. by discriminating in admissions, the state is labelling them as second-class citizens. Like again says, well, it says the state making a statement of racial preference in immigration necessarily makes a statement of racial preference domestically as well. Now, I think that does often provide strong reasons for states not to discriminate in admissions. But one limitation is that this only applies to states that are not already homogenous, religiously, ethnically, whatever, and want to remain so. Also, I think perhaps it's more important, the argument hinges upon the injustice done to existing citizens by discrimination, but not on the wrong that's done specifically to the excluded candidates. So you might think the focus here is in the wrong place. The primary injustice of discrimination is the wrong that's done to people who are excluded, signalled to existing citizens as secondary, though may still be important. So, I think for a better answer, we have to think about the kind of claim that the economic migrant can make. He or she can't claim a human right to enter. That's I've already argued. Typically, though, he's going to have a strong interest-based claim, given the potential benefits of migration and the cost of doing it. So, if the state's going to turn down the request, it must provide a relevant reason for doing it. And here I'm relying on what I call a weak cosmopolitan premise, which I can perhaps express in the following way. The idea that we owe all human beings moral consideration of some kind, so their claims must count with us when we decide how to act and what institutions to establish. And in some sense, we must consider their claims equally. So there's a kind of weak cosmopolitanism, I think, which applies to all our interactions with human beings. So imagine for a moment that an immigrant could be admitted at absolutely no cost to the receiving state, but great advantage to that immigrant. Then to turn the application down arbitrarily would mean that no consideration at all had been given to this person or to their interests. They'd be treated as though they were morally insignificant. So if you accept that weak cosmopolitan premise, then a selective immigration policy must offer relevant reasons to those who are going to be excluded. So what can count as a relevant reason? Well, I think the criteria we use to select migrants must connect to the gender goals of the political community. So it's legitimate to favour those who are going to be more valuable as members by virtue of the kind of skills they bring with them or the contribution they can make to the cultural and political life of the community. Now these values are internal to the political community itself. And there's no guarantee that they'll also count directly for the immigrants. So there's a sense in which you don't exactly have to justify a policy to the immigrant. What you have to do is provide sincere reasons that connect to the democratically determined goals of the community. Now these tend to be comprehensible to the immigrant, even if he or she doesn't actually endorse them herself. So I think that the reason that discrimination, selection by race or religion would be outlawed is that these criteria can't be linked in any remotely plausible way to the values that the community may wish to pursue. So somebody who's refused on those grounds are having their interests set back without being given any kind of adequate reason for the setback. And that's the contravention of what I call the weak cosmopolitan requirement. Okay, so now finally, I want to say a few words about people I call particularity claims, who have a particular claim against particular state. And there are various possible, I'm just going to talk about two cases here, the ones I mentioned before. Immigration as a form of reparation, and immigration in response to desert. So, in the first case, the right to immigrate is being claimed as a way of redressing some wrong that the receiving state has inflicted on the prospective immigrant. In the second case, the claim is that the person deserves to join society by way of reward. Now, the young Oxford scholar called James Suter has argued for immigration as reparation, and his argument is that if a state becomes responsible for the harm involved in making somebody into a refugee, then it owes them reparation, and granting asylum is very often the most fitting way in which this can be done. And that seems right. And there are historical examples like the Vietnamese boat illustrated. But notice here that if you simply focus on refugees, the question arises, is it reparation, or is it their refugee status that's really doing the work? In other words, the refugee has a primary claim of human rights protection, potentially could be lodged against any state, but there's something particularly appropriate about the state that's caused the problem offering the asylum. So maybe the idea of reparation is less important than simply singling out one particular state as bearing the responsibility to protect the human rights of the refugee. So let's think about somebody who's not a refugee but simply claims immigration as reparation. Now, I think there's no problem. I've defended the idea of states bearing collective responsibility for external harm and for having obligations to repair that harm. So there's not a problem, as far as I can see, wrong with the general claim. The bigger problem, I think, is to explain why the right to immigrate is the appropriate response to harmful behaviour. I think generally about the problem. Supposing one state inflicts environmental damage on another state, for example, it allows pollution and an oil spill to contaminate the coastline of a second state, causing serious harm to people who live there, then the right way to make reparation is to remedy the damage directly, clean up the oil spill, clean up the pollution. In other words, the point of reparation here would be to bring the lives of people who've been harmed back to the pre-damage condition as nearly as possible. And generally, it's going to be better to do that by rectifying the situation on the ground, as it were, than to move them to entirely new surroundings. Of course, now there could be cases where the harm is such as to make the territory completely uninhabitable, and then immigration might well be the appropriate way to provide reparation. Of course, many have argued that global warming is going to produce cases of this kind, so we're going to be reparative claims on the grounds that their territories have become uninhabitable as a result of global warming. And it may well be that even though the causes of global warming are rather diffuse, they may be able to lodge reparative claims against any state that can be shown to have made a significant contribution to the global warming that's made their existing territory uninhabitable. So I think there are going to be some cases in which immigration as a form of reparation is going to be justified. What about the desert claims, the second category? Again, I think the problem is going to be to show that immigration rights are an appropriate way of responding to deserts. And the most relevant cases seem to be cases of military service. So, for example, the French Foreign Legion, has a rule whereby anybody who served the Legion with honour and fidelity for 3 or more years is entitled to apply for French citizenship. For those who can't wait for 3 years, there's been since 1999 a further law which says that those who are wounded in battle while fighting for France can apply immediately, becoming Français par le sang versé. So, you can say with the incentive considerations can apply here, but also it's a clear, I think, reserve rationale. And how better to recognise and reward somebody's contribution by being willing to fight for the country by giving them citizenship. Now, in Britain, there's a similar case that's arisen in the case of the Gurkhas, these Nepalese soldiers who fought in the British Army and had wanted to retire to Britain. And they had a high-risk campaign headed by the charismatic actress Joanna Lumley, so they actually succeeded in getting the right to come to Britain after they'd done their service as Gurkhas. But actually, the experience had not been altogether good. They found it difficult to live on the pensions that were provided in Britain. And so now the British Gurkha Welfare Society now campaigns not for immigration, but for enhanced pension rights, which would allow them to live in some comfort in the poor. So I think that what this shows is that when people have contributed military service to the state, what they really say is something like the conditions for a comfortable life and not the right to immigrate as such. So sometimes immigration is going to be a way to provide that, but I don't think there's some kind of internal link between deserved reward such that only giving rights of residence is the only way you can recognise the deserved military service. So I think that just about particularity claims in general then, what I think is clear is they can have very strong claims against the state, but it's a bit harder to show that immigration, the right to immigrate, is the appropriate response to those claims, rather than some other form of provision, alternative to immigration. So now, coming towards the end, the question might be, how to weigh up the justice claims of immigrants? I suppose in one reason or another, the volume of immigration is capped. The state decides it doesn't want to have more than so many net migrants in any given year. What kind of priorities should it set? Now I think it's clear that refugees and particularity claims have, in general, stronger claims than economic migrants. These two categories have stronger claims. But if you ask the question, which of those two have stronger claims, I think the answer is it's very hard to say either outweighs the other in general. So refugees have strong substantive claims based on their human rights to be admitted somewhere, but may only have rather weak claims to be admitted to this particular state. Whereas particularity claims have strong claims to be given special treatment in this state, but it's not so clear that the favourable treatment must involve being granted the right to immigrate. What you can say, though, is that people who fall in the intersection of those two groups, in other words, they're both refugees, but they also have a particularity claim, they have some kind of lexical priority, they should go to the top of the queue. And that isn't actually a trivial finding, because they may not be the people the state most wants to attract. They may not be, in other grounds, particularly attractive. They may not have particular skills, for example, the receiving state has most need of. So I think by saying that justice requires immersion of those people, one is actually putting some quite a significant constraint on the state's preferred immigration policy. Can we say any more about the choices between refugees and particularity claims? Just to sort of try and put a bit of flesh onto the rather abstract bones. Suppose you're the United Kingdom Border Agency. For some reason, you have to make a choice between two applicants. One is a refugee from South Sudan who can credibly show that her life is in danger, which is an outstanding, outspoken critic of the regime, but who has no previous connection to the UK. That's one. Then on the other hand, you have a young man from Iraq who worked as a translator for the British Army during the Gulf War, but he can't find work, though so he's poor, but he's not actually in desperate straits. So who has priority? Who should be taken first? Well, you might think the Sudanese woman, because her human rights are more immediately at risk. Time is of the essence. But perhaps eventually she can claim less than the Iraqi man, because the agency may have made arrangements for Sudanese refugees to be accommodated, say, in Kenya, and that may offer protection, adequate protection for human rights. Whereas the Iraqi man may have a desert claim that actually can be relieved by giving him opportunities that come with being to Britain. So I think that that's true, that we can't say anything in general about this priority between these two candidates. So in conclusion, although I talked here about the direct obligations of justice that states owe to immigrants, one can't in the end ignore these wider questions about social and political justice that I've been bracketing off. So on the one hand, there may be social justice reasons for admitting particular classes of immigrants. For example, those who help to provide essential welfare state services, for some reason locals are not willing or able to provide. But there may be global justice reasons against admitting those very same immigrants if the effect is to deprive people elsewhere of services that they need to safeguard their human rights. So there's arguments about the brain drain, the effect of the brain drain on very poor countries, for example, in the case of medical services. So those reasons will come into play when the selection criteria have been in fact formulated, especially for economic migrants and also for some asylum seekers. So justice and immigration is very often going to be a case of weighing up claims, and a just immigration policy is going to be one that first establishes an unconditional right of admission for a small group of refugees. While beyond that, it's a matter not only of developing consistent criteria of selection, but also of responding to claims appropriately, that's to say, with treatment that matches the circumstances of each respective immigrant. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before you start the discussion about this lecture and presentation, on behalf of the University of Rijeka, I will give you certification. Certificate that you've done this presentation. Okay. It's in English and also in English.
Professor Thomas Cristiano, who will discuss the paper Justice and Immigration.
That was fast.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to comment on David's paper, Justice and Immigration. I've been reading his works for many years with great admiration, and in particular, I've liked David's work on migration and human rights quite a bit. So I've learned quite a bit about it. It's very illuminating work. What I'm going to do today is just focus on a couple of things that I wanted to discuss in the paper. I'm just going to give a super brief summary of some of the claims, at least as I'm focusing on. So, David Miller offers a conception of different claims of justice migrants may make against the state they wish to enter. He argues in favor of the theses that refugees have rights to be given asylum somewhere outside the state that threatens their most basic interests. Refugees do not, however, have the rights to reside in the state of their choice. Economic migrants, which include migrants fleeing serious poverty as well as migrants merely attempting to improve their economic positions in life, do not have any right to enter any society outside their own. They may be protected by certain contextually determined requirements of non-discrimination. There are other potential migrants who may be owed entry into a particular society on the grounds that they have performed a special service to the society in question, or on the grounds that they've been especially harmed by the society in question. So these are the three categories that David carefully characterized in the paper of refugees, economic migrants, and particularity claimants. Now these propositions concern what is owed as a matter of justice to the potential migrants. Miller takes as his position, takes as given his position that what some owe others as a matter of justice depends on the nature of the relationships between them. Miller posits as the basic relationships relevant to the discussion of migration, the relationship between state and citizen, and the relationship of state to migrant. He argues that the relationships between state and citizen and state and migrant are different, and that the demands of justice are quite different. So let me just first say something about the case of refugees. The thesis that the demands of justice among persons depends upon the relationships in which they stand asserts that there's as I understand it, asserts there's a kind of prior relationship. I say normally it's of coercion or cooperation or common identity, or in some cases of harm, as in the case of particularity claims, which is such that the demands of justice among persons who stand in those relationships are dependent on those relationships. The particular demands of justice also apply only within the context of those relationships. Now, one might think that relationship refers to a kind of prior pattern of interaction, like, again, cooperation or harm or something of that sort. But in the case of the relationship between people in one country and refugees from another country, refugees who wish to flee persecution or other life-threatening harms, that case is quite distinct. The idea here seems to be that these people are, the relationship is characterized by the fact that they are fellow human beings, and this is a relevant relationship. So Miller asserts in this kind of context that all human beings, quote, share in a responsibility to protect the human rights of vulnerable individuals, unquote. The idea here is that human beings have human rights, which are, quote, rights whose joint fulfillment provides their bearer with the opportunity to live a minimally decent human life, unquote. These rights constitute the most urgent moral demands that one human being can make against another. The grave moral importance of the protection of the opportunity to live a minimally decent human life imposes a duty on all human beings to protect these opportunities. That's the basic view of human rights. Now, this is applied to the case of refugees, as I understand it. In that refugees, their rights, their human rights are being violated. There are opportunities to live a minimally decent human life in their home country are eliminated or undermined. And so thereby the rest of the world, then by virtue of the rights, the initial rights they have, the rest of the world has a collective responsibility to ensure that these people can move away from their home society into a decent and safe environment elsewhere. Not necessarily in the country that they choose, that they want to move to, but certainly to a decent and safe environment. I think that's a humane and reasonable thing to say, though I'm not sure what some of the terms mean, and so this is going to be the part of where I'm beginning to express some word. I'm not sure what the notion of relationship is that we're dealing with. And the rights and duties in the case of refugees that are articulated in the paper and elsewhere in David's work seem to me to be fully cosmopolitan, or cosmopolitan rights and duties, not dependent on any prior relationship between persons in the sense of a form of interaction or pattern of interaction between those persons. The relationship is merely the fact that they're human beings, I think. And I think I remember this from the earlier work on human rights. Now, this is an unusual use of the word, of the term in this context. But I don't want to quibble about the use of the term here. But I will say a bit more about it in a minute. I just want to flag this distinctive feature of the relationship between refugees and the receiving, or potentially receiving countries. The second term that's of interest, and that is, I think, somewhat uncertain here, is the idea of opportunities to live a minimally decent human life. The idea of a minimally decent human life in the discussion of refugees, I think, at least the reference is fairly straightforward in this case. It seems to involve a life that, in the case of a refugee, is a life that's sort of threatened imminently with the possibility of death, or very grave harms, or loss of freedom. So also, I think David wants to include economic, very bad economic conditions, such as famine that threaten starvation, and so on. Now, the term minimally decent human life here, I think, in this context, refers to a situation where we're talking about some, basic conditions of survival, or at least minimum freedom. That's not particularly difficult to grasp. But the expression is vague, that is minimally decent human life, once we go beyond these sort of minimal requirements of survival. So I'll discuss this word in a minute. I want to say a little bit about the issue about economic migrants. I think this, to me, was the more perplexing part of the paper, and I may not have understood it or maybe confused about some of the theses. But these are defined, quote, as those whose human rights are not at risk by remaining in their country of but who have a personal interest in moving to the new society for employment or other reasons, unquote. It seems to be kind of a large category that covers all those who are not fleeing life-threatening conditions or loss of freedom. These people are not in desperate need. That's another way they're characterized. Nevertheless, a category, as far as I can see, covers a very heterogeneous group of people that I think are morally quite distinct. And so this is where I want to sort of probe a little bit. It seems to cover the case of a doctor, say, trained in Mexico, trying to improve her already good income by going to, say, Canada. But it also seems to cover the hundreds of millions of very poor people in sub-Saharan Africa and farmers in Mexico and Central America, as well as South Asia, who want to flee conditions of great poverty. They're among the 2.5 billion people who live under the $2 a day line of poverty. These are conditions that ensure that these lives are relatively short, stunted, opportunities are not very great, and painful, and often threatened with serious harms, but not imminently. But they're not threatened with the kinds of harms that are characteristic of asylum seekers. So Miller says that, quote, for this category of immigrants, states are not under constraints of justice with respect to how many to admit. They can close their doors entirely if they choose to do so, unquote. Now, I can see why, say, when I think this of, say, the group of middle-class migrants, like doctors moving from Guatemala to the United States or something like that, can conceivably be excluded by the wealthy countries. But I don't see the rationale for excluding those who live on less than $2 a day. So let me just say more about this concern. So the first question, so the question is, so what is it that distinguishes these kinds of cases, the refugees from very poor people? Question is, we have to ask, what is it in the scheme of thought that permits this rather radical break between refugees that have a right of entry somewhere and very poor people that conceivably can be closed out from everywhere? We need to look at the notions of relationship-dependent justice and the idea of a minimally decent life. But even if we cannot make sense of these notions in a way that non-arbitrarily distinguishes between what morality requires regarding refugees and what it requires regarding very poor people, we must still ask, second, why there is such a strong threshold effect separating the moral concern for refugees and the concern for the very poor. Now, perhaps the conception of relationship as interaction is doing the work. These economic migrants do not have a prior relationship qua interaction. David describes this as a specific relationship with the members of the wealthy society. So there's simply no demand of justice imposed on the members of wealthy society. But remember, of course, in the case of refugees, there isn't such a relationship either. So it's unclear why there should be such a sharp separation between the case of refugees who need no relationship qua interaction to give reason of justice to those in wealthy societies to make sure they're safe, and very poor people who seem to not have give reason to wealthy societies in this respect. Furthermore, so that's one thing, the question about the relationship. Furthermore, the minimally decent human life seems to be unavailable to refugees. It seems available to these very poor persons. At least I think that's got to be the assumption dividing the two categories. But why should we think that the 2.5 billion very poor men are living minimally decent human lives? Why? What is it about the minimally decent human life that gives us any reason for thinking that there is such a sharp divide between these cases? I'm afraid I don't know what the answer is to this question. I don't know if there is one. So that would be the first worry, which is I don't see how this, I think it's got to be this notion that's doing a lot of more work in separating out these two categories. But I don't know if the notion is sufficiently well characterized in terms of a set of criteria to divide between these cases so sharply. But let's suppose that there is some set of criteria that answer the question as to why refugees cannot live a minimally decent human life in their home countries, and very poor people can. Let's suppose that there's some reason to think that this should make some difference to how they should be treated. The question still remains here, even if we permit this, as to why there's no claim of justice on behalf of the very poor to admission to wealthy societies, such that the wealthy societies do not have to open their doors at all. After all, the differences between refugees and very poor people is a matter of degree, at least if we're thinking about their capacities to live decent lives and in terms of their fundamental interests. And the differences between their capacities to live decent lives, refugees and very poor people, is massively smaller than the difference between either one of those groups and middle-class migrants. Okay? So you have these two groups that are, I think, relatively close, and the others that are quite different. So it's hard to see how the appropriate difference in treatment between refugees and very poor people should be so great. The grounds are not that different, and yet the treatment seems massively different. At the same time, the treatment of middle-class migrants and very poor migrants is supposed to be the same, even though their respective well-being is massively different, I think. Okay. Now, it might be one could say, well, look, it's justice does not demand that every poor migrant be admitted. Okay. Poor migrants or very poor migrants do not have rights to be admitted. And so, in some sense, there's no requirement or demand of justice to admit very poor migrants. So it's not the case that for each one of these very poor migrants, they have a right to entry. I think that probably makes some sense to say that. And so, in a sense, you might say, well, we're not talking about rights here. We're talking about something, and we're not talking about justice. But David's not putting such a great deal of weight on the notion of justice here, on this idea, because in a footnote in response to libertarians, who says may not think that refugees have positive rights to be taken in, Miller argues that we might still have, quote, humanitarian reasons, as opposed to reasons of justice, to respond to cases in which human rights are put at risk by the actions of others. So the practical difference may not be so great in the cases that concern us here, unquote. So the thought is here that, yeah, maybe we're not dealing with justice, maybe we're dealing with a humanitarian concern. But David recognizes that in many circumstances, the differences between these types of concerns is not that great. Okay. And since we're looking at refugees and very poor persons, the differences between the threats to their well-being, they are different, but it's not clear that they're great enough to make such a great difference in treatment. So the last quote, or this last quote that I've suggested, suggests that even if there are only humanitarian reasons for taking care of the very poor, there may still be duties on the part of wealthy states to partly open their borders to them. Now, this would be connected with the humanitarian duty to help the very poor, which help. Now, this has to be connected with a supplementary premise, which I'm sure David would want to sort of explore more, but which is that, well, our attempts to aid very poor people in other parts of the world have proved to be quite elusive over the last half century. And it may well be, I think, the best at the moment that we can do, and for a significant amount of time, to help the very poor, is allowing them to migrate to wealthy societies. Now, admittedly, this burden would have to be shared among wealthy countries. It's not uncommon for humanitarian duties. So in the end, I don't see a satisfactory case for the great difference in treatment that David is asserting. Defensible difference in treatment between refugees and very poor migrants. There is some difference in urgency between these two kinds of cases. I don't see how it can justify anything like a sharp cutoff that justifies the right of any genuine refugee to be taken in to some safe and decent society, but that allows society to completely close their borders to very poor people. Now, this is not a trivial point. The number of refugees today is thought to be between about 10 and 15 million people in the world, while the number of very poor people is about 2.6 billion people. Okay. And polls suggest that a very substantial proportion of this 2.6 billion people would like to migrate to wealthier countries. So the quantity of migration suggested by including this group, or some substantial proportion of this group, assuming that it's not the case that each member has each person has a right of entry, suggested by this number, the quantity of migration is staggering. But it may be, but my thought is that the principles that are offered by David imply that actually a very large proportion of these people ought to be able to migrate to wealthy countries. So it seems to me that just to close, that the thought is going to be something like, you either say, you give rights to entry for refugees, at least somewhere up in the States, and at least try to make it a duty of states to bring in a large proportion of very poor migrants. Or if you deny that there is such a duty, then it seems like a right, the very plausible right of refugees has to be either denied or massively weakened. And so that's the question I posed. Thank you very much.